So precarious work, it's an issue at Policy Options that we cover quite a bit. And I think it's because it encompasses so many interrelated public policy issues. It relates to automation and advances in artificial intelligence. Look at the stories this week about Amazon's new grocery store where I'm not sure that there are any actual human beings working there. Precarious work relates to our labor standards and how we're treating workers. This week at Trent University, just as an example, there was a rally of food service workers who were trying to bring attention to the fact that a greater and greater proportion of those food service workers are now part-time employees. And precarious work relates to education and retraining and how we're going to help older workers and how we're going to help our young people. And I'm sure if you're like me and have children at home, you have a certain amount of anxiety about what their future will hold in the career world. And precarious work also relates to the conversation that's happening around the world about income inequality, including this week at Davos, and whether our social safety nets have holes that need to be mended. So we have a really great panel, super excited about it, who are going to look at the latest statistics and trends, and so dissect this issue of precarious work. You have their bios, but I'll introduce them very briefly, and I'll ask them to come up onto the stage. Francis Fong is the Chief Economist at CPA Canada. Wendy Vuyk is the Regional Coordinator of the Eastern Region at the Ontario Centre for Workforce Innovation. And Sunil Johal is Policy Director with the University of Toronto's Mowat Centre. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Now, I cannot possibly be the first person to tell you that new technology is threatening our traditional notions of what a job or a career is. I'm sure that's a narrative that's been talked about quite a bit, and certainly Sunil will go into this with far more experience than I could muster. But suffice to say at the outstart that its impact on how we think about jobs is going to be very significant in the coming years. Now, but we've been down this road before. You know, the most recent experience that I can think of is the decline of the manufacturing and the traditional goods producing sector back in the 1990s and early 2000s. But what I think is different this time around is what we learned from that most recent experience. Now, at that time, we still had a very strong attachment to a particular narrative that labor markets adjust. If new technology is displacing workers, it displaces some workers, these productivity improving technologies would lead to a shift in the labor market. More people would move into those high productive sectors. We'd raise our standard of living. And those people who were impacted and displaced, they would somehow find their way back into the labor market somehow. They'd figure it out. And I think what we've learned is not that labor market adjustment doesn't happen. Certainly it does. And certainly how fortunate we are to live in Canada kind of speaks to that, and the wealth that we have speaks to that. But I think what we overestimated was the ability, and certainly the economics profession is guilty of this, that we overestimated the ability of the labor market to absorb those people that were impacted by technology and automation. And if I look at what we see now as pulling on that kind of cohesion of society and our economy, those forces find their roots, at least in part, in the disenfranchisement of some of those groups that are feeling the effects of automation and technology the most. Well, fast forward 20 years, and we're in a very, very similar position. We're on the cusp of a very similar position. New technology is now encroaching on sectors that were previously insulated from the impacts of automation, namely the services industry. And as workers are being displaced, the work they end up finding may be more volatile, more insecure, and offer less protections than what we would envision gainful employment to look like. So it is critical now that we spend time talking about this issue and making an effort to help people figure it out. But we face significant challenges in doing just that. It may or may not surprise you to hear that we do not know precisely how many Canadians are affected by precarious work. And part of the reason is that, like many advanced nations, Canada does not have a formal definition of precarious work, nor data on those people. I mean, what do we even call precarious work? Like, when you think about it, what is precarious work? We all have ideas. When I say precarious work, you envision somebody in your head, a continuous contract worker, a part-time worker hired by a temp agency, someone working in a dangerous job, things like that. We all have those ideas, and there have even been a number of very, very good reports produced by a wide range of institutions that have tried to define and size the so-called precariat. But they all differ. The definitions differ, our views differ, what we envision differs, and those size estimates also differ. And there's no one, say government, trying to pull all this stuff together to say, this is the definition. Here's what we should all rally behind. Here's the definition that we can hang our hat on. There's no one doing that. This is not to say that government has not been looking at this issue. That's definitely not the case. As far back as I can tell, Statistics Canada has been tracking this issue as early as the early 1990s, which interestingly, this actually has contributed partly to this issue because at the time, they weren't ever talking about precarious work. They still don't talk about precarious work. What Statistics Canada tracks, which is more precise, is the rise of non-standard work. Things like part-time employment, temporary employment, and what's called own account self-employment, which is if you're self-employed and you don't have any employees, so you're just working for yourself. Because this is actually what we have data on. We actually have data on all these different groups related to non-standard work. And we know that those working in non-standard work arrangements are more likely to be facing precarious work conditions, simply by the nature of those arrangements. Part-time and temporary workers tend to make less than their full-time counterparts. Getting enough hours worked might be an issue. Uncertainty around contract renewals, things of that nature. If you're self-employed, there's an inherent volatility to your income. So we know that these people working in these situations are more likely to be, or are at higher risk. So we started talking about non-standard work in relation to precarious work as a proxy for precarious work. And at some point down the line, the two became interchangeable. This is not ideal because we're not, from a policy perspective, we're not defining a problem and then collecting data on it to figure out what that problem looks like. We're letting the data define our problem, or the lack of data define our problem. We can easily think of a number of people in non-standard work that we probably wouldn't consider precarious, like a well-off retiree who has a good pension and is working part-time to keep busy, or that high-paid IT consultant that might be working on a very short-term continuous contract basis, but they're making a six-figure annual income. Like, we probably wouldn't worry about those people, even though they're part of that non-standard work cohort. The challenge is that we cannot differentiate who truly faces precarious work conditions from those who don't, using data that was never designed to capture the nuances of what being precariously employed means. And conflating non-standard work and precarious work is also an issue because it doesn't allow us the focus to design targeted policy that helps those who need it the most. This is a big problem because the existing data do actually allow us to say certain things. It allows us to point to certain groups of individuals that are at higher risk of being precariously employed than others. And in our recent report, we dissected just that. So on this first chart, many of you might be familiar with this. It shows the share of, Sunil and Wendy maybe can't, it shows the share of total employment that part-time work and temporary workers hold in the economy. Now, I think there's a couple of ways to slice and dice this data, but some people might take this data and say, maybe it's not as big a problem as we might think. Maybe non-standard work is not as big a problem as we might think. Because for one, the share of total employment that part-time work holds hasn't much changed since around 1993. So in the last 25 years, we haven't seen any more people than we did in 1993 working part-time. Temporary work has grown. It's grown by about 2 percentage points since we started seeing the data in 1997. But its share is relatively small, and 2 percentage points over 20 years is not. Some people might characterize that as not being that big. So there's a couple ways to look at that. But one narrative might be that it may not be as rapidly growing a problem as we might think. But the devil's in the details here. If we cut this data in a different way, we can tell a different story. That flat, quote-unquote, share of part-time employment that we saw since 1993, in actual fact, most industries, this is the breakdown of part-time employment by sector, you can see that most industries have actually seen a decline in part-time employment, except for three. Just 3 sectors have seen significant increases in part-time employment. That's info, culture, and recreation, education, and accommodation and food. The three being accommodation and food is relatively self-explanatory, same with education. The info, culture, and recreation, the recreation I think is relatively self-explanatory as well, and pretty much anyone in the recreation industry. But the info and culture relates to things like news media, the entertainment industry, which you might actually, now that I tell you, it actually might make sense that they're bringing on more part-time workers, because maybe that's the nature of the business. But those three industries have seen very, very significant increases in part-time employment. Looking at temporary employment, those same three sectors show up as posting the three largest increases in temporary employment. Now, this is disconcerting because two of those three sectors, info, culture, and recreation, accommodation, and food, pay some of the lowest wages on an industry average basis across the entire country. And educational services, interestingly, pays some of the highest average wages, but has some of the lowest average hours worked. Now, to me, what that is saying is that, so fine, maybe at an aggregate level, part-time and temporary work may not be as rapidly growing a problem as we might think. But we are seeing it grow significantly in sectors that might have more precarious characteristics. So there's pockets of risk going on. There's also kind of a demographic angle that we can point to as well. This chart shows you the breakdown of part-time employment. Again, between that period of time in which the aggregate share was flat, there was actually significant declines among certain age cohorts and in certain genders, and then significant increases. And the interesting thing about this chart, there's a couple of things you can point out about this chart. The first is that the increase is almost concentrated entirely among 20 to 24-year-olds, which at least kind of lends credence to this notion that young people are finding it very difficult to land full-time employment right after graduation. And again, Wendy will probably speak to this with, again, far more expertise than I could. But, but one thing I do want to point out is I've at least had a couple of conversations about these 20 to 24-year-olds. And some people will say, well, we shouldn't worry about those people because they're in school. And okay, fine, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that notion. But the way I think about it, if we think about the average kind of 4-year degree, the average person, we'll say graduate at 22, and which means 23 and 24-year-olds are starting their careers, which means 2 out of the 5 years of that age cohort, you do have people trying to make their way into the labor force. The average 4-year degree is also a very narrow view of what post-secondary education looks like. Tons of people will get 2 or 3-year degrees, college degrees, go to a trade school, what have you, in which case you're starting to include some 21 and 22-year-olds. And it's also a very narrow view to think that everyone goes out and gets a post-secondary education. Like, there are plenty of people who only have a high school degree that are trying to get a foothold into the labor market. So the instant you start thinking about education from a wider perspective other than a 4-year degree, you realize that more and more people are trying to make it out there, and the options that they're seeing are more non-standard in nature, which I think we should be concerned about. But obviously there's an issue with how to interpret this data, which is clearly the case. More to the point, we are actually seeing part-time employment rise among people who are more higher educated as well. So this data shows the breakdown of the percentage point change in the share of part-time employment among 15 to 24-year-olds by highest education achieved. And you can see the largest increases are happening among women who either have at least a high school degree or some post-secondary education. So there's real concern that we need to be considering here. The last chart I have to show you is on temporary work, and it's a bit of a mixed bag here because what we're seeing is, so I broke it down by age cohort, by gender, and also by type of temporary employment. Temporary employment gets broken down into term and contract, casual employment, and seasonal employment. The basic conclusion of the chart is that what we're seeing temporary work grow among younger women and older women the most, and younger men and older men to a significant degree, but to a lesser degree than women. So you're basically seeing it happen, or it gaining prominence among certain groups. And you can find out more if you're interested at the link here. I think what I want to get at here, ultimately, the point is, we cannot say with certainty whether or not all the people in this jumble of data are actually precariously employed. Again, we get back to this point of they're in non-standard work, but we don't know for certain whether or not what they're facing is precarity. And that's pretty much the general conclusion we can make. My point is that we have learned all that we're going to learn from the existing data. We need better data at this point. And we haven't even talked about own account self-employment, on which there's even less data than part-time and temporary employment. There's some, but it's not that as fulsome as what we can talk about on the other side. What we need now is a formal definition, one that we can all rally behind, and data on the issue. And we're calling on government to do just that, to bring together the experts necessary to land on that definition and provide funding for Statistics Canada to start tracking this stuff. Canada's labor market is on the cusp of great change, and precarious work may very well define our future. Yet even today, we don't truly know how many people are affected. I think it's time we change that.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be talking to you today a bit about the technological implications of what we're seeing in areas like artificial intelligence and automation. And this is all stemming from a report we wrote back in November 2016 called Working Without a Net. It's available on the Mowat Center website if you're interested in reading it. But essentially the crux of our analysis was that most of the policies and programs that are intended to support Canadians, intended to support workers, are very intimately tied to the notion of a standard employment relationship, because most of these programs were designed in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when the labor market looked very different than it does today. It was basically assumed that one person, generally the husband in a family, would have a full-time job with benefits. That would be and those benefits would be enough if the family encountered any medical, dental issues or anything like that. You'd have a pension. And if you fell out of work, it would be very rare, and government programs would kind of step in that rare occurrence to help support you. But I think the reality is we're not in that environment today, and we're actually going to need to radically rethink our social programs and policies to reflect today's new world of work. So there's just three quick longer-term trends I wanted to touch on in terms of the labor market, and then I'll get into some of the tech stuff in a minute. So those three things are unequal prosperity, the rise of precarious work, which as Francis has very clearly outlined, there are some very fuzzy definitional issues to address, and then very quickly declining unionization. So I mean, the idea of unequal prosperity I don't think is a very new one to most of you. I mean, the notion that the 1%, the top 10% are getting outsized gains of wealth as it is generated in the economy. I mean, there are lots of different statistics and figures you can cite to support this notion. I mean, there's just one here on the slide. So the top 1% of earners in Canada accounted for 37% of overall income growth between 1981 and 2010. The chart on the left shows you the Gini coefficient, so a measure of inequality in societies. And it's not actually been going up too much in the last 15 or 20 years in Canada, but it's kind of incrementally continuing to inch up in a direction that's probably not ideal for most people. The other thing that we need to think about is the idea that wage growth is really a challenge for many people today in Canada. Researchers at MIT have termed this the great decoupling. Historically, when the economy was growing at 2, 3, 4% a year, people could expect their wages to grow in lockstep with that broader economic growth. That's for too many people today no longer the case. If you look at workers in Ontario, if you're not in a management position or a professional position, you have seen zero wage growth over the last 20 years in Ontario when adjusted for inflation. And obviously, during that 20-year period, your costs have been going up and up and up in terms of housing, childcare, food, and energy. So for too many people, their paycheck is staying the same, but all of their other costs are continuing to rise. And that's, again, a challenge for many working Canadians. Now, we've already touched on the rise of precarious work, and as Francis has noted, there are a lot of challenges around defining what that means, but if we look at things like temporary work, part-time work, they have been on the rise. Non-standard work, which I think it's not a perfect proxy for precarious work, but there definitely is a strong correlation. Non-standard work in OECD countries has accounted for 60% of employment growth since the mid-1990s. So Ontario's Changing Workplace Review actually looked at this issue, and they tried to dig more deeply into what exactly is a vulnerable worker in the province of Ontario. And I mean, I won't get into the methodological details, but essentially they found that roughly 30 to 32% of Ontario workers are classified as vulnerable. So having characteristics like low wages, no benefits, et cetera. Research by the United Way and McMaster has found that roughly 50% of jobs in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area have elements of precarity. But again, there are some challenges with that in terms of some people who are in casual or temporary employment may actually be making very good living. So if we're looking at even at that 30% figure, I mean, that is a concern, I think, for policymakers. In terms of precarious work, what does it mean? I mean, these non-standard jobs that we're talking about tend to be lower in wages. I mean, there's about a $10 per hour differential between a non-standard worker and somebody who's engaged in a standard employment relationship. The figure on the left shows you folks in standard employment tend to have much greater access to things like medical insurance, dental coverage, and employer pensions than the much smaller bar, which is next to them, which is folks who are engaged in non-standard forms of employment. And then obviously there's this overarching issue of declining unionization. So who's standing up for these people who are in vulnerable positions, who are engaged in precarious forms of work? Increasingly, it's not unions, because these people are not in positions that are entitled to union representation. And there are lots of different reasons for that, but I think if you could point to corporate strategies around things like outsourcing, franchising as a major driver of this type of situation. So that's kind of what's been happening. Now we can start thinking about what's going to happen when we start looking at some of these technological trends. So I'll very, very quickly touch on a couple of these things, including the unique nature of the digital economy. I mean, increasingly we're talking about a very small number of firms in the global economy which have massive amounts of power in terms of economic concentration, but also granting or denying access to particular sectors of the economy. If you think of a company like Amazon, $600 billion valuation, if you want to sell or buy something online in many parts of the world, that is pretty much the one place you're going to go. I mean, if I started up sunilretail.ca tomorrow, probably none of you would ever go there, much to my chagrin. I spent a lot of time setting up a fancy GeoCities website, but the reason for that is something we call network effects. The more people who are on these platforms, the more valuable those platforms become to users and to non-users. And those network effects can be very powerful in terms of crowding out new competitors. So we're going to be entering a world where there are significant concerns around issues such as monopolies and control of markets by very particularly small in number platforms, but very large in terms of valuation and power. I mean, we've got all kinds of challenges in this new world when you think about people who are driving Ubers, for example. Are they employees? Are they independent contractors? These platform economies, these gig economy models are often intentionally finding gray areas between what is personal, what is commercial, and leveraging that for their own profitability. How do governments keep up with that reality? Now, the big topic that everybody's talking about and excited about these days is automation, it's artificial intelligence. Are the robots going to come and take my job? Hopefully not, but we don't know. But this chart, I think, is a very instructive one for a number of different reasons. This shows you the growth in jobs in the United States over the past 35 years or so of 4 different categorizations of positions. And the story in Canada is pretty much the same. Not quite exactly the same, but very close. Just very quickly, so the red line at the top, those are non-routine cognitive jobs. Those are the kinds of jobs that have been seeing significant growth over the last 35 years. And if we project forward, and you think about things like artificial intelligence, what can we program computers to do well, and what can we not program computers to do particularly well? We can program computers very well to do things where there's a discrete set of rules. We know that there are 5, 10, 15 different elements of a job. It's kind of like a decision tree. If this, then this. If this, then this. That's not a non-routine cognitive job. I mean, most of the people in this room, if I know a lot of you work in government or in kind of the policy world, you would fall into this group. I mean, you're using your mind, but what you do changes on a very dynamic and day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, high degrees of judgment, high degree of uncertainty in what you're going to be doing on a particular day. So those jobs are increasing, and if we project forward, you can probably assume safely they're going to likely continue to increase. And then the line at the very bottom, which has also grown fairly steadily, as you can see, those are non-routine manual jobs. So again, you're an electrician, you're a plumber, what you do day to day is going to change. One day you're wiring a house, then you're going into a school and fixing some kind of knob and tube wiring issue. Again, how do you program a robot to do that? It's very challenging for people to think about that right now. I mean, maybe in 20 or 30 years that will change, but odds are those will be the last jobs that will be affected. The jobs in the middle where you've seen stagnation and in fact a little bit of a dip, those are the routine jobs, routine cognitive, routine manual. So routine cognitive, maybe you're a telemarketer. You have the same kind of script in front of you every day. These are the questions you're going to ask somebody. If they say this, then you ask this question. Those are the jobs where there's going to be automation, there's going to be job loss. Same for routine manual jobs. If you're a forklift driver and you drive pallets of material from one end of a warehouse to another, there are already machines that can do that. If you go into any of Amazon's fulfillment centers, they've got hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands at least of these robots that are delivering pieces of packaging and goods between different parts of the warehouse. And there are lots of different ranges about what automation is going to mean for the economy in terms of job loss. I mean, ranging from as low as 5 or 9% all the way up to over 40%. If you apply those numbers to Canada, you're talking 1.5 to 7.5 million jobs that are at a high risk of being eliminated over the next 10 to 20 years or so. And again, that doesn't mean new jobs won't be created in that time. Obviously, they will be, and that's always been a part of our economic growth. Jobs are eliminated and new types of jobs are created. But you can imagine, at the high end there, if we're talking about nearly half of jobs in Canada that exist today being eliminated within 10 and 20 years, what are the repercussions of that in terms of retraining people, particularly adults, who are thrown out of a job? If you think of autonomous vehicles, 500,000 people in Canada drive for a living. And obviously the technology there is already really good. I mean, the companies like Google are testing autonomous vehicles in places like Arizona, California, and Ontario. The technology is pretty much there. There's some regulatory issues, there are some other issues, but you could easily imagine a world where in 5 or 10 years, autonomous vehicles are on the road in a fairly significant way. What happens to those 500,000 people in Canada who drive for a living? If you've been a bus driver for OC Transpo for 20 years, how do we retrain you for a different type of career? What are the supports in place from government and or your employer to prepare you? And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was this idea, which I think Francis has really kind of covered quite well. It's a very mixed bag in terms of who's engaged in independent work, who's engaged in the gig economy. McKinsey did a study, I think it was 2 years ago, looking at what they classified as independent workers. And they found that 70% of workers in this space, I mean, this is more the gig economy type thing, so the Uber driver, the person who's delivering stuff on those type of platforms, 70% of those people do this type of work as a preferred choice. They like it, they like the flexibility, they like the supplemental extra income that they're earning. But 30% do this out of necessity. They don't really have an option. This is what the only thing on the table for them to earn money. So when we're thinking about policy responses, obviously we need to focus on those people who are doing this out of necessity by and large. We're not so worried about the person who's happy with what they're doing and they enjoy this. And we'll talk some more about policy responses, I think, at the end. But I think the general message I have for you today is even if we hit pause on technological progress today, we have some significant work to do to refresh our social architecture. If technological progress advances as some think it will, then we have much more than some significant work to do. We need to radically rethink all of the social programs and supports we have in place in Canada today. So look forward to engaging in a discussion with you on this. Thanks.
Our first initiative in December of 2016, we went out and talked to as many employment service providers and literacy and basic skill providers as we could in the province, including school boards, in order to hear feedback from the people who are helping job seekers. We wanted to know what their concerns were. We also wanted to hear what their dreams were or their innovative ideas. And we asked them questions like, if you suddenly had funding for 2 more full-time positions and could do anything you wanted with them, what would that be? And the 2 responses we got across the board were, we need to help our job seekers with mental health issues, And the other piece was we need to help people make informed career choices because our young people in particular and many other job seekers are at a loss. There's tremendous pressure in our culture for young people to answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And similarly, when we're at barbecues and parties or you run into a friend on the street, that question about what do you do? So much of our livelihood is attached to our work. So the insights that we gained from the job seekers was that I think the province in Ontario is at a crossroads and many other nations are as well. And so our goal is to help move things forward. My favorite part of career exploration and working in workforce development is looking at labor market information. And most people will tell you that labor market information is right only about 50% of the time. So other people will say, well, why bother? Why bother exploring, or why bother trying to predict? But the reality is things are changing very rapidly, and we can help people be better prepared for the future of the world of work. Sunil and Francis have touched on some of the trends that are really booming, everything around autonomous vehicles, changes, the gig economy is here to stay. So at OCWI, our goal is to help prepare people. And so looking at the future of the world of work, we like to help our job seekers and those who are supporting them become more informed about the fact that we are in the fourth industrial revolution. And every time there's been an industrial revolution, things have changed. There's always been panic. Oh no, the sky is falling, jobs will be lost. And yes, jobs will be lost, but new ones will also be created. So my passion after 25 years as a career counselor and in secondary education, helping people make those informed career choices, has really been finding a way to say, this is what might be on the menu. Here's our best guess, and here are some what we think are educated decisions thanks to many of the experts who are doing great research in the field. I also have a passion for mature workers, because I have so many of those folks coming to me and saying, I've been laid off, I need to find something new, and I don't know what to do. My heart would break when a 55-year-old would say to me, I've just been laid off, I have 2 kids in university, I still have a mortgage to pay, what's there for me? And it's a challenge in our system when a lot of these folks who manufactured, I know GE in Peterborough is in my territory, I'm Eastern Ontario, and the community is in crisis because General Electric is going to close, and there are people who've been there for many, many years. My fear for them is that they will write out their severance package, then their employment insurance benefits, a couple of years will go by, and then they will reach out to the services of an employment counseling center. So my hope is that we can get to those folks much earlier in the process so that they can make informed choices, just like my hope is to get to the students who are in grade 8 making their secondary school, high school career class choices. And there's a lot of pressure on them to make those choices, those life-changing decisions now. I should preface all of this by saying I do look at this through a very optimistic lens. I am very excited about the future of the world of work, and I like to share this message because we do know that one of the best predictors of someone's career trajectory or having a positive career is their level of optimism or hope. So I think it's really important for us to share as much good news as we can, particularly for our young people who are making those career choices. 65% of today's elementary school children will work in jobs that don't exist yet. And we have to think about, I remember my family having a party line on our telephone, let alone cell phones. And so if we look at the amount of change that we've seen in the last few years and the number of organizations that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, things like Uber and Shopify and autonomous vehicles. I think getting ready for all of this is really important. And also to look at the job loss in a very realistic way, but also to be positive and open-minded about the other jobs that will exist. If we think about autonomous vehicles and the 500,000 people who are currently driving for a living, there will be job loss there. But when we think about the domino effect of what other things will be created as a result of this new invention. And I'm very, very passionate about organ donation, and I think there's panic right now. With self-driving cars, there will be far fewer car accidents, which means organ donation will hit a crisis point. We won't have enough organs because the majority of organs come from motor vehicle accidents. So how can we then look at the workforce changing around artificial organs? We know that they are exploring now organs that are coming from other species. Pig parts are being placed into human being parts. So how can we look at what the new things will be that will evolve out of the innovation that's happening in the world of work now? We will enter a world of work where people will need to function as entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and intrapreneurs. So I think most of us know what an entrepreneur is, and somebody who wants to have their own business and have it grow. A solopreneur is somebody who wants to work independently, wants to have their own business, does not want to ever have employees or staff. They just want to do their own thing. Intrapreneurs is a new breed of employee where someone acts and behaves and thinks like an entrepreneur, but for another employer or within a larger employment setting. So having those skills to think like an entrepreneur on behalf of your employer. And what we're seeing is that those are the people today who are being promoted, and those are the kinds of skills employers are looking for. For me, a big part of that is financial literacy. I know that if we look at the predictions, and there are many, many predictions around the number of careers people will have, a young person might have today if they enter the workforce. And some of the statistics vary quite a bit, but it's as many as 10 to 17 jobs for a young person by the age of 38. So if we think about the days, I remember my dad, he was a firefighter, and he said to me, Wendy, just get in with a big company, get a good pension, stay there for 30 years, and then retire. And that's not the reality in today's world of work. So how can we be prepared ourselves for the future of the world of work and to think about our careers as a business? There's an increasing emphasis on soft skills. So as Sunil mentioned, with the impact of automation and AI and robots taking away those routine jobs, the robots don't have necessarily the compassion and the ability and the resourcefulness and the ability to pivot and change and think quickly. So those are the kinds of skills we want to foster in our young people in particular. Similarly, if we think about the career path that many people are on where it's very linear, they want to do that and retire at 65, we have to rethink the world of work for our mature workers as well. The retirement age of 65 was set here in the 1930s when life expectancy was 62. So we didn't expect to have all these people retiring and not working. The idea was that you worked until you died. But now we will see people have many career paths and maybe work in a while at what they were trained in, and then take a year and do something that is more in line with their values and their volunteer work, and then retrain, and then maybe do something else for 5 or 6 years, and then try that new thing that they've always been wondering about. Or maybe I want to become a yoga instructor. And the reality is people will move and swim back and forth through the career path. And in the home stretch, because life expectancy is increasing now, there are many people who will live well past 100, and a child born today, I'm hearing predictions, will live to be somewhere up to 104 or 110 even. So that's a long time to be out of work if you did retire at 55 or 65. So we think about what will be people's legacy careers. So I do get very excited about the future of the world of work because I think people will have choice, but I think we also need to be very mindful of making sure people are prepared. The unprecedented change is here to stay. If we think about the global world of work, where I might be working today from 2 o'clock till 10 o'clock tonight because one of my teammates is in Hong Kong and somebody else is in Brazil and somebody else is in Hawaii, that global world of work means that work won't be Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. We'll move away from that factory-based industrial model. And it's okay then to be walking your dog at 2 in the afternoon if you're working at 10 o'clock at night. So our values around work need to change as well. Because of the globalization of the world of work, we need to be polite, empathetic, and we need to have cultural sensitivity and cultural awareness. And I think that will come, but because of the way the world is changing, but I think we also need to change our education system to make sure our young people today are acquiring those skills. One of my favorite things to talk to young people about is becoming a polymath. And what is that, Wendy? And it's somebody who's well-rounded at a bunch of different things. Skilled, really well-rounded. I'm so happy to see the introduction or the return of Wendy Vuyk. And I'm so happy to hear when a young person says to me, I'm going to take a gap year. And I have so many parents who panic at the words gap year. They're so worried that their child will take time off and not go back to school. But the reality is anything we can do to help our young people become more worldly, or for all of our job seekers to help broaden their experience in the world. And things like traveling abroad. What's interesting to me is prior to joining OCWI, I was with the Pathways to Education program. We launched it in Kingston, Ontario. There are now 18 sites in Canada. We did a study with a PhD candidate at Queen's University with our students. These are young people, high school students, coming from families living multi-generational poverty. Many of them were coming from families where no one had worked ever in the family. Lots of dependence on different forms of assistance. So we interviewed the students to say, where are you getting most of your career advice from? And these are kids that are having guidance counselors. They were part of our program. Across the board, it was still their parents. And it was parents telling them, don't go into the skilled trades. You don't want to get your hands dirty. Don't go into blue collar. You must go to university. And not in any way exploring the many, many options that are out there and the many different careers and how things will change. And so if we can reach our parents, and if we at social settings can be talking to one another about the fact that taking a gap year is not necessarily a bad thing, and that education for today's young people will be re-education and re-education. And for our mature workers, to encourage them, for our educational institutions to welcome them and embrace them and provide that kind of training for the people who are getting laid off that's really meaningful, and get to them earlier in the process before maybe they get laid off. If we can create a culture of lifelong learning, it will benefit everyone. When we talk about the future of the world of work, I think it's really important to also include employers. And the reality is we do have employers who are forward thinking. There are many, many forecasts about a critical labor shortage, globally, nationally. And there are a lot of people who are saying to me, yes, but Wendy, I still have my 24-year-old living in my basement playing video games. I hear that an awful lot from parents. And then I have other folks who just take whatever job because they think that's the only thing that they can get. I think if we can shine a light on those employers who are being forward-thinking and progressive, it will provide some optimism for everyone. The laws of supply and demand, I think, are already causing employers to be proactive. There are manufacturers in Ontario who are actually having dark days where they have to shut down their entire system and not operate for a few days because they don't have enough staff. We, at OCWI, right now we have about 50 different research projects underway. We have a great team of researchers, and we work with our community stakeholders to explore innovative practices. So we look at ideas or things that are already happening, and we let the organizations operate new programs and foster those ideas, and we put the research around it. It's amazing to me the number of people who are focusing on manufacturing. And we're hearing on one hand that yes, manufacturers are laying off, but we have others who can't find the help that they need. So some of them are being very creative. There's an aerospace manufacturer in Peterborough, Ontario, who is really having a hard time finding staff. And they were actually talking about closing down. And instead what they did, they welcomed snowbirds. So there were lots of folks in that community. It's a popular retirement community, the Kawarthas and everything else. But there are people who live there during the summer months, but they go to Florida for winter. Similarly, there are many people with young families, small children, and so this employer's worked out an arrangement where he hires the snowbird during the summer months, and that snowbird in some cases might have been at the local hardware store or Tim Hortons or Walmart, and then they go to Florida for the winter, and then in the summer months, the parent with young children, they work during the winter time so that they can be off when their kids are out of school. So seeing employers who are being quite resourceful and thinking of new ways to attract and retain talent, I think those are the people we need to shine a light on. And I think if we do that, other employers will catch on to the fact that, wow, if they're doing that, maybe I should start thinking about how I'll attract and retain talent. We're working with quite a number of employers in the Lindsay area right now, which is on the fringe of Toronto, and they lose a lot of their talent to the GTA. And we're helping them rewrite their job descriptions. They've been cutting and pasting the same posting for 10 or 15 years with the same requirements without having thought about it. And they're eliminating a huge pool of talent. We're also working with them to look at prior learning assessments, particularly for newcomers in Canada, who have great skills and experience, but because they don't have a particular piece of paper, employers are ruling them out. We heard about Starbucks, and there are many employers who are looking at ways of attracting talent in part-time work and offering benefits. We're starting to see a shift there. We're also starting to see those employers who are recognizing that the soft skills are more important. There are engineering firms in the Silicon Valley who are will only hire liberal arts grads, and they teach them the engineering skills. So to create an environment and a climate where employers are encouraged to be forward thinking, and so often it's just a capacity issue. They're so busy focused on their business or manufacturing whatever their product is that they don't have the time or energy to step back and look at the big picture. There's others that are being progressive. Mitsubishi in the Mississauga area was having a hard time finding manufacturing for their aerospace industry. So they finally put an ad in the paper and said, we want to hire youth. You do not need a high school diploma. Come join us. We'll train you. They do the training. And if they like you and you like it, because manufacturing is only for some folks, then they take you on permanent full-time with benefits. So employers are finding their own ways to recruit, and they're getting out in front of what I think will be an issue to attract and retain talent. So I think with our employers and our educators and our employment counseling centers, there is reason to be optimistic, and I hope that you'll spread that optimism. And I think the best way that we can do that is to stay connected and to continue to communicate around this topic. There's our contact information for OCWI. If you go to our website, you'll see our newsletter, and we're looking very much forward to spreading the results, the word about the results that we have around our research. Thanks.
Thank you.
If you think about the continuous contract worker who doesn't get their contract renewed and they can't make rent, or the part-time temporary worker that is tough time putting food on the table, or the low-income precarious worker who is in an abusive job but can't speak out because it's the only job they have, it's always that they're at the margin. They're at some sort of margin, and that margin for me is they don't have enough to be able to plan and save for the future. And that concept, I think, is what should anchor our notion of what a precarious worker is. Like anything, if you are at that margin, you are at risk of something. And then what's on top of that is all the other factors related to that, things like income volatility, uncertainty if you're a contract worker, uncertainty related to contract negotiations and things like that, such that anything that happens can push you under that margin, and suddenly we have an outcome that we don't want to see.
So you could have a really great job, but it could be still precarious?
Exactly. So and that's a great point. That threshold might not be static. We might say, hey, here's the threshold for some people, and even a little bit of volatility can push you below that. But that threshold should probably vary with how much your income varies over the course of a month-to-month basis. So the two should definitely be related in a very tangible way. So that's a great point.
We've always had seasonal workers. We've always had part-time workers. Yeah. What is it about now that's different than before? I mean, you did address this a little bit in your presentation, but yeah. I think because our mind goes to people who work in the fisheries, or people who are sessional lecturers and so on. Is it just that there's more people in particular sectors that are affected than before? That's
a good question, and I think that's a tough question to answer as to why our perception of this issue may be worse than, we've always had part-time workers in Canada. Like, why now? Why do we worry about them? But I think it's also the nature of how jobs are changing. I think, maybe back then you could have a part-time job where you earned a decent wage and you got benefits, and maybe the things have changed in a way that maybe that's not feasible anymore. I'm struck, the Ontario government actually just released data, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, about starting wages for people who graduate with different degrees. And the only one that's been able to sustain the same real wage over the years has been engineering. Everybody else has seen a decline for different degrees. People with a business degree, people with a humanities degree, social sciences, life sciences, everything has seen kind of a deterioration. So, there's been that pressure, I think, even with higher educated people. Certainly those pressures would be the case for part-time. And so kind of coming back to this notion of what I would want to see, based on this definition, I think a definition of precarious employment should have a number of kind of components to it. First, you have that earnings threshold, and then you have everything beyond that. You have, how do you capture income volatility? How do you capture uncertainty? How do you capture, like Sunil pointed out, how do you capture preference? Certainly these people are, if we say they meet the earnings threshold and they have a certain amount of volatile income, well, maybe their partner has a stable, high-earning job, and so maybe they're not precarious, even though individually they might be precarious. They're not actually precarious. How do you capture that fact? And lastly, how do you capture this notion of, if I'm in an abuse, like in particular low-income workers, how do you capture this notion that I have a fear of speaking out about an abusive job? I think that needs to be part of it, even though that's not my particular area of expertise. I still think that needs to be part of it. And my wish list would also include that you cut that by demography, by gender, by age, by race, by immigrant status, by Aboriginal status, because we know there's evidence out there. For example, the Law Commission of Ontario has already kind of put out this report a number of years ago that said racialized workers, and particularly women, are at higher risk of precarious work. So certainly those demographic aspects have to be there on top of those 4 or 5 aspects I kind of talk about.
So Wendy, how do you talked about some of the skills that I was very interested in that about being polymath, having those soft skills. You hear that a lot. And I mentioned that there was a big career advising conference just this week in Ottawa with thousands of people from across Canada. So how do you prepare young people? I was struck also by your statistic that 65% of jobs for elementary age kids don't even exist right now. How do you prepare them for jobs they don't even know are going to exist? And should the focus be on a base set of skills rather than the specific ones that they'll need for a particular position in the future?
Well, I think it's the more well-rounded we can help our young people become, the better, because without knowing what those jobs are, I think it's the ability to deal with change, certainly, being resilient. Letting our kids fail so that they learn to bounce back again. And giving them experiential learning opportunities that take them outside of their sometimes it's a video game world. I worry about that. Sometimes I'm heartbroken when I talk to young people and I say, and I don't ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up, because I don't like the question, but it often comes up, and so often they say video game designer, mixed martial arts fighter, or something like that. I'm not even really sure what that is. Or it's rock star or something like that. So, and I love that spirit, and if we can foster that, but I think that to encourage our parents to encourage their children or create opportunities for their children to have those sort of life-broadening experiences. The reality is, in the secondary school system right now, our guidance counselors, where I know when I was in high school, I went to the guidance counselor and said, what do you think I should do? And they would give me the pamphlets from the universities, and they say, well, you could do all these things. And it's different now, because I think our guidance counselors are very burdened with the drama and trauma of high school and the mental health issues and increased suicide, everything. It's troubling what our guidance counselors are having to deal with. So I think as a society, we need to create an opportunity for our young people to try things out. And I'm a very big fan of students or young people being able to travel, which I know there are many barriers to that for some folks, but to help them acquire the problem-solving skills. And I worry sometimes that our students and our youth aren't getting that. So it's the problem-solving skills, resilience, effective communication, that financial literacy piece around entrepreneurship that I mentioned, that so we see so many young people drop out even first year post-secondary, not because they couldn't keep up academically, but because they couldn't cope financially. So how do we have to impart those skills in them, and I think by giving them opportunities to try new things.
So bringing it back to the idea of precarity, do those particular skills insulate you from precarious work, or is it just that you are ready to roll with the punches when you do get into your career world?
I think it's a matter of ready to roll with the punches, but if we can even get to that sort of tipping point where they want the gig economy work, where it becomes an accepted reality, and maybe that they see some of the positive benefits of the new world of work that we are entering, and so that they are more motivated to prepare for it. I still think that there are many other youth who will struggle. There will be people with barriers to employment, young people with barriers to employment. We have to find ways to address those. And I think it's basically the education system. At the Career Counseling Conference, it was Connexus here in Ottawa for 3 days, over 1,000 people from across Canada and several other countries. there was tremendous focus this year, rather than on workforce development, it was very much on K-12, preparing for career readiness. But there was actually a book at the conference on career development for preschoolers, which was sort of scary for me, but at the same time, to have that conversation regularly and routinely, that every experience a young person has prepares them better for the world of work.
So Sunil, you mentioned our social architecture and whether we're prepared for the shocks to the labor force. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by?
Sure, and I just want to actually pivot off of what Wendy was just speaking about in terms of the education system as an example of this, and I'll give you a couple of other examples. But essentially, I think we're in a very complacent place in Canada right now that we have a robust social architecture. We're not the United States. We've got all these wonderful programs. Quite honestly, the fact of the matter is we underinvest in social programs compared to other advanced economies. But we seem to have this disconnect between what we think we do and what we're actually doing. And this isn't really an investment issue when we talk about the K-12 education system. I mean, Ontario spends $25 billion a year on education, but the question becomes in areas like this, would you design the education system in Ontario the way it is designed currently if you started from scratch today? And almost across the board, the answer to that would be, oh no, you would not. I mean, why do students take 2.5 months off in the summer? There's very strong research that when they come back from their summer break, they backslide by a month, 2 months, and they're losing instructional time just catching up from where they were last year. I know there's a reason why that will never change, and I won't say why that will never change, but I'm sure if it starts with U and kind of rhymes with onion, but that's not going to go away. But I mean, if we look at other areas like skills training, for example, I mean, Canada spends 1/6 the amount per capita that a country like Denmark does on active labor market programs. Why is that? I mean, again, there are lots of reasons behind it in terms of our preference for lower tax rates, but if we're entering a world where we need to develop resilient, responsive, adaptive social programs and policies, we can't just assume that what we've got in place now will work well. I mean, employment insurance is a good example. So fewer than 40% of unemployed Canadians today are actually eligible for EI compared to over 80% in the late 1970s because the nature of work that people are doing has changed. They're not eligible for EI. Does that make any sense? No, we probably want to have options around things like wage insurance. Maybe you lose one of your 2 part-time jobs, so we can fill the gap for you for a little bit of time so you don't slip into a really challenging situation where you can't meet your rent, you can't purchase good food for your kids. So I mean, really across the board, we need to start thinking about how can we develop social programs and policies that wrap around people's actual lived life experience. They're not kind of based on bureaucratic imperatives and specific silos of, well, this is how the EI program has always run, that's how it always has to run. That's not really going to work effectively in the future. And if you look at things like skills training, I mean, Wendy mentioned some good positive examples of employers who are helping their workers prepare for the future, but at a macro level, employers spend 40% less on skills training for their employees per capita today than they did in the early 1990s. Corporate profits have gone up by 77% as a share of GDP since the early 1980s. So corporations are making more money than ever. They're investing less money in their workers than ever before, and government policies and programs aren't actually filling that gap in any real way. So I mean, if Canada wants to be the global magnet for talent and for companies like Amazon and Google to set up shop here, I mean, we really need to step back and say, what matters to us? It matters that we have highly skilled workers. It matters that when somebody is put out of a job that we support them, and we really need to get moving on that as soon as we can.
We've been talking a lot in Canada about minimum wage, but I take it a lot of precarious workers, that doesn't even apply to them, right? They don't even have access to minimum wage. So is that another piece of our social architecture that we should be giving some more thought to? Basic guaranteed income is, there's a lot of talk in Canada about that right now. There's a pilot program in Ontario. What do you think, Francis?
I think the challenge to this, or the potential solution to this problem is not going to lie with one program or another. I mean, Sunil's already talked about challenges related to EI. What if I didn't work enough hours to qualify for EI in my particular region, or whatever the case may be? You know, minimum wage, same deal. What if I'm not paid by the hour? Can I guarantee that contract workers are getting a pay bump because the people who, you know, maybe their colleagues who are getting paid by the hour got a pay bump? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe not. I would hope so, but maybe not. So, I mean, the reality is that the solution to this is going to cross all these different lines. And I think that was probably what was most kind of interesting about this topic, is that when, you know, as you're researching it, it crosses so many lines, like so many policy topics. Like you're getting into, obviously, labor market policy, you're getting into social programs. It definitely breaches into the space of like talking about low income. And very possibly, given who it impacts, you're talking about, you know, immigration policy, perhaps. Like it crosses so many of those lines, and so the solution is going to, in turn, cross all of those lines as well.
Sunil, what do you think about the minimum wage issue in terms
Sure, and to build on what Francis was saying, I mean, that's the exact challenge with this. It's kind of one of those classic wicked policy problems where, well, it's federal, it's provincial, there's private sector involvement, there's labor side involvement. How do you get all those players together thinking about these issues holistically in a forward looking way? But I mean, I think a basic annual income, I mean, there are a lot of advocates for that right now, especially in this age of technological uncertainty. What if there aren't enough jobs for people anymore? How do we expect them to make ends meet? Well, one answer a lot of people are proposing is a basic annual or a guaranteed annual income. And I mean, I think there is merit to this idea, but the question becomes very quickly, if the problem you're solving for is not enough work to go around, that also likely means you're going to see a decline in personal income tax revenue, probably also corporate income tax base, as the companies are increasingly offshored and not necessarily located in Canada. So if that's the problem we're trying to solve for, who's actually funding the basic annual income when we're talking about a shrinking tax base that is now all of a sudden expected to provide more and do more for people? So I think there's merit to looking at it and then thinking about it for certain segments of the population, but when we talk about actual universal basic income for 15, 20, 25, 30% of the population, it very quickly becomes an unaffordable situation. I think the much better strategy for countries like Canada is how do we focus on becoming that talent magnet, that talent attractor, so that companies are coming to set up shop here. We're not the jurisdiction where a large chunk of our labor force is now out of work and we have to worry about how to support them. So I mean, that to me, it should be the race to the top is what we're talking about here, not, it's all doom and gloom and we're not going to be able to do anything. We better implement these kind of pie-in-the-sky social supports to help out. So.
Sorry, go on.
Just to jump on that point, I mean, you know, when we talk about guaranteed annual income or basic income or whatever term, I mean, there's already a bunch of pilot projects out there that even now, you know, you start to question the feasibility. Like if someone comes out and says, hey, here's a fiscally feasible approach to basic annual income, sure, I would be game for that. But you know, I think it's a challenge to get to that even now, let alone in the future. If we are talking about a world in which you know, you have very few capital owners and workers kind of making all the income, and everyone else is on basic annual income. I mean, even just the notion of that, imagining that, is very dystopic if you think about it. Like they made movies about this kind of stuff.
Well, let's hope it goes in the optimistic direction, which is that there will be new jobs, different jobs, and you mentioned that employers are having to alter, or they're having to make themselves more appealing because they need workers. So Wendy, can you talk a little bit about that? Could there be any pressure exerted by workers, knowing that there's shortages, to improve labor standards and make sure that benefits are kept in place, for example, and so to provide a cushion for some of that precarity?
I think so. I think there will be, there's already momentum around that, I think, and employers who are engaged and listening are very wise, I think, to be hearing that. But I think we will see a shift where quality of life will matter. And we've seen it in other countries where work-life balance, and even at the conference the last 3 days here in Ottawa, there was a lot of information about that a positive employer who wants their business to thrive will need to treat their staff really well. And that means flexible work schedules to work around childcare pickup and drop off. It means transportation. You know, particularly in Ontario, we look at transportation as a significant barrier for many people. rural and urban as well. There's still communities where buses don't run on Sundays and that sort of thing. So I think that the employers are we know of companies that have a rent-to-own option for a car. So you start working for them and the company provides you with a car. And it has nothing to do, you don't need it. It's not like a traveling salesperson or anything. It's just to get from home to work. And then as they continue to work, they pay off the car and then they own it. Creative carpooling options, and allowing people to be really present at work, so that if that means that they need to work from 10 till 3 and they are much happier at work, they will stay there, they will stay on. I think for many employees, I think it's important for employers to realize, what's the conversation around the dinner table at night when somebody goes home from work? Do they say, oh, you know what I got to do to work today, or this was really good? Or are they moaning and groaning about their boss and complaining about how restrictive it was, or being fearful of getting let go? So I think to create that culture, but I do think employees, as we see the demographic shift, their voice will become stronger.
We've come almost to the end, so I thought I'd just wrap up with the last question to you all, which is, what happens if we do nothing about precarious work? We say, well, it's a small percentage of the population, it's really not a big deal. What does this all lead to, or what's the overarching problem for Canadian society? This big question.
That is a big. I mean, for me, my biggest concern is that people who are falling into precarious work, that over time they become less and less attached to the workforce, and they become less and less attached to the institutions that underlie our social contract, and that social contract starts to deteriorate, which we are seeing in a number of countries. And that's a scary thought, to think that the place I grew up in, that I'm proud to live in, is going to turn into something that I wouldn't recognize, and we don't have that kind of shared sense of community. So I mean, that's very soft. I'm sorry, but
no,
that's kind of
well
that's
said.
that's kind of how I feel about it. Is if we let this fester, it turns into that.
Thank you, Wendy.
I think people will fall through the cracks, and I think we would start to see cycles of people just giving up, and I think they would lose hope. We'd lose that spirit of your best job is your next job, because you learn from everyone that you have, and I think we'd see an increase on all kinds of forms of assistance, but I think people would lose hope, and I think when that happens and they give up, I think then there's a tremendous cost to that is probably immeasurable, but I think it would be significant.
Thank you.
So going back to something I mentioned, we're not as generous as we think when it comes to social programs and policies. If we want to walk the walk that we globally like to talk about, how inclusive we are in Canada, we need to actually think about, how are we funding these programs? How are we supporting the 25, 30, 35, 40% of people who are engaged in precarious work, who are struggling to make ends meet? And I think there's a big disconnect between policymakers and their lives and what the lived experience of too many Canadians is. And until we bridge that gap and people realize that a lot of Canadians are really struggling, we're just kind of aimlessly wandering down this path, which I don't think is healthy for us as a country.
Thank you.